All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Nunez Community College for our monthly history lecture series. Thank you all for coming and braving the cold rain to be here tonight. We're so delighted to have you all here. I want to start by thanking our sponsors that make the monthly history lecture series possible. A special thanks to the Greater New Orleans Foundation ExxonMobil grant that funds this program. Also the Miro Foundation and the St. Bernard Tourism Commission. And we have one of our former members here with us tonight, Ms. Gail Buckley. So thank you for being here. And we want to thank all of our sponsors for their generous support of this program. Let's give them a round of applause. And in addition to our generous sponsors that fund the program, we would not be able to do this each month without the support of our fabulous St. Bernard Parish historian, Mr. William DeMarini Highland, who works diligently with us each month to help curate this program, select our speakers, and put together this series. So we owe him a debt of gratitude. He is our Nunez Community College Chancellor's Vision Award recipient this year, and we want to give him a round of applause and thank him for dedicating his time. And he will be introducing our distinguished speaker tonight, Ms. Colleen Billiot. So let's give it up for Mr. Bill Highland.
Well, thank you all so much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I've had the great pleasure and privilege of knowing Colleen since she's very, very young. Her grandfather, Pete Billiot, was a great fixture, a leader in our community, and he was so proud of his Native American Houma ancestry. And he was one of those who helped us to establish a Houma presence at our Los Isleños Museum complex. And Colleen is very much like him. A remarkable young lady, a native of St. Bernard. She attended Hannon High School. She's an alumna of Hannon High School. She co-founded the Houma Language Project, and I see some of her partners are here tonight from the Language Project. And as one who's been very interested in the Isleños, we understand that a language is very often the consummate manifestation of a cultural identity. So to have documented a lost language and to have worked to revive it is something that just is absolutely incredible. Today, Colleen works with us constantly at the museum complex. She's always working to try to bring the Houma descendants community in St. Bernard together. Her Tasso Time is a wonderful program which she has at our museum complex. She brings people like Janie Luster, who's here tonight, a basket weaver, who does beautiful work. Excuse me, she's just remarkable. And of course, Colleen has her bachelor's degree in international relations with a minor in German from Tulane University. And she also has a master's in conflict resolution from Georgetown University. And she's also a certified instructor of basic self-defense for women with rape aggression defense systems. So you know what? We have to be careful around Colleen. But in any event, Colleen's family is here tonight. It's a wonderful assemblage of people here. And so now it's my great pleasure to ask Colleen to come out. And I assure you, you will be delighted with the wonderful presentation she's going to share with us tonight. She's going to make her culture come alive. Colleen, please come out.
No pressure whatsoever with that introduction. And that would be the Houma Language Project contingent. But good evening, everyone. Yakoke, thank you for having me. Y'all, you threw me off. You mentioned Papa Pete, and now I'm stuck. But aletu, Seyah Chefuya, Colleen Billiot, Seyah, St. Bernard Mentele. Hello, my name is Colleen. I'm Houma, and I'm from right here in St. Bernard Parish. And I was very fortunate. Catherine Lemoyne reached out to me and said, will you participate in our history lecture series? And so if you didn't like history before this, I hope you enjoy it enough to start studying more history afterward. Let me see if I can find the clicker. So why history? Why is history important? I know some of you actually already enjoy it, but when I got asked to do this presentation, I had two quotes that were kind of going through my head a lot. And one of them was, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And the other was, "History is written by the victors." Hey, Victor, right? If you don't know Smoke Signals, it is Native American Heritage Month. That is your first reference. Please go forth and learn. That's a great film. But I really wanted to reframe how we think of these quotes. And I would say to the first one, those who do not learn from history, those who do not know their history, they are missing something in their own identity. There's something that they can know about themselves. And also, yes, we do often repeat history unknowingly, but it's not always a negative thing. There's a lot of good that comes down, and especially for Native people, there's a lot of tradition that carries down, even when we don't realize how much we've maintained and we've retained. And as for history is written by the victors, obviously when we're talking about Native peoples, yes, a lot of the written history was written by those who had a written language, meaning colonial forces, Europeans, British and French and Spanish. Almost forgot those, how dare I, in the home of the Isleños. But, oral history cannot be overlooked. For this presentation itself, I got to speak to my great aunt Janie. I had other interviews from different elders and from my own father and my uncle and my aunts. I was asking them questions. But the story I love to tell about this, and I've got to watch, I was told not to get off on too many side stories. But when we talk about oral history, why is it important yet it is so often overlooked by academics? One of my favorite ones is that when the Europeans, the British and the French specifically, first came to Louisiana, or what would become Louisiana, they came across the Attakapas and also the Chitimacha. And both in their oral stories and their storytelling had an animal that sounded exactly like a mastodon. And these European groups said, no, there's no way. There's no way they know what a mastodon is. It's purely coincidence. Well, by the late 1700s, when those peoples had been displaced and forced off their traditional lands, there was a shift in the waterways, and what do you know that they find? The remains of a mastodon. Because oral history for Native peoples, storytelling is how we carry down our knowledge, our traditions, and our understanding of the environments that we live in. And so these elders who had first seen these remains remembered them, and they told their descendants about them so we would know everything we could about our environment. So you can never completely discount oral history. You shouldn't discount it, at least. And then I also want to point out that history is tied to culture, including language. I never understand why in a lot of academia they separate language and culture, and can contribute to community cohesion in the present. What I mean by that is this. Again, history is where a lot of our traditions began and they carry down. We have an epidemic in certain states and in certain parts of Indian country of Native youth suicide. And there have been numerous studies that show that participating in your traditional ways, in your culture, gives you a positive identity, and it creates a protective factor so you have better life outcomes. And so a lot of what I do, what Houma Language Project is, what Tasso Time is, we'll talk about those later, they're really to not only give youth that tie, but they're for the whole community to strengthen our connections. These are the things that got us through the challenges of past centuries, but they're also the things that are going to get us through the challenges we face today, like a diaspora due to climate change and due to erosion and due to hurricanes decimating things. Now, it's hard to condense several centuries of history into 45 minutes, so I'm going to try and breeze through things as best I can. But I want to start, you see that title, Dazed and Confused? This is where I'm going to take a sidestep here. If we'd have been just talking about the Jesuits, it would have been dazed, confused, and hangry. Even if you have never been a fan of history and you don't like going to find old sources, please go read the diaries of the Jesuits. Take the time, enjoy yourself for an afternoon. It's a delight because they got into so many mishaps they didn't know which way to turn. So yes, that's my side note. I am going to jump between these topics a little bit because I want to talk about first, there are inextricable connections between Houma history and Louisiana history. And every single one in this room already knows something that was influenced by the Houma. And where it says Iti Houma, you would otherwise know it as Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge is the red pole, Iti being the tree or the pole, and Houma being red, was the red stick that separated Houma territory and Bayugula territory. Painted red, had a bear skull on it, some other accessories, and you can see a memorial to it on that side that still exists in Baton Rouge today. That is not the original pole. I did have someone ask me that before. You'll notice the lack of bear skull. But so we were up above Baton Rouge. We're in what are now called the Tunica Hills. We'll talk about that as well. But that's where we started. We were largely an agricultural people. In fact, got to go back to the Jesuits. They said we were indolent, we were lazy because we only hunted when we needed to. How dare we? We had beautiful crops and gardens around all of our cabins. But let's go back up. So there are differences in perspective and in worldview because we lived a very different way than the French who came and hung out with us, spent some time with us. And some of the things that they noted were this. We had hereditary chiefs, but we were a very egalitarian society. There were not hierarchies in our system, in our village or our structure. And quite frankly, we had a figurehead like the British monarchy does now well before they ever did. They had their power stripped away a little later. But we did have a hereditary chief when Iberville came to the village. Oh, I have to backtrack again. This is why I got warned about my side stories. So everyone knows De La Salle, well, the Houma know. De La Salle saw the Houma in 1682, and then they jumped to Iberville in 1699, and poor Tonty gets left out of everything, but he actually visited the Houma before Iberville ever did. So I'll give him that little credit there. And we know this because as soon as Iberville showed up, our hereditary chief said, hey, look at all these pretty things we've saved that your friend brought us several years ago. So I like to give him that credit because he gets forgotten. But we had our hereditary chief, and basically it was said, he participated in ceremony, he was part of greeting people that came to the village, but he could not make a decision on his own. There were respected members of society, men and women alike, who were almost like a council, and so they helped make the decisions. And let's talk about the women part of that. There were not these rigid norms and gender norms with regard to roles. So we had women who were participating in ceremony that even in other tribal cultures they would not be allowed to participate in, such as creating and drinking the black drink, for those who know Southeastern indigenous history, during our mourning ceremonies. And they could also be warriors. In fact, when Iberville showed up, he was writing about and talking about a very well-respected female warrior. The leader of our people's warriors had actually died the year prior, and she was still being mourned. And being the Houma, we said, look at her bones. Because we kept them. But we really did. We were very egalitarian. Men and women, could take on different roles. And not just that, I think we broke another stereotype. We talk about women had a lot more liberty, and another stereotype was we were not somber. We were not these black and white photos that you see in the late 1800s, early 1900s, get stoic. That's another Smoke Signals reference. There you go. When the French would come to the village, they would write about, they have to hug us and caress us in their way. We were very touchy-feely, we were very tactile. But the lamentations, this is what really got me. Because so often, again, it's that stoic, that somber face that we hear of natives having. But the Houma wept, and they were very willing to admit when they were concerned or when they were sad. So at this time, the French were our allies, but the British were the allies of the Chickasaw. And so whenever warriors had to leave, either to go hunt or go into battle, every time they left our main village, we had another smaller one further downriver, whenever they left our main village, all the women would weep and they would wail because they might get taken and enslaved by the Chickasaw or by some other enemy. But at the same time, if we did go to battle and we did burn down a village, we took in all the remnants of that village and we wept for them as well. And we grieved for what they lost, and then we adopted them into our families and we married them into our families. And we said, look, a healthy, robust population that's not inbred by the European monarchs. Spain had a problem, that's all I'm saying. So we were very in touch with our emotions. But I talk about the lamenting for those we took in, those we went to war with. And that brings us to one of the predominant roles of the Houma in their sphere of influence in this region. The Houma were the peacekeepers because they could either mediate your struggles or they were going to take you down. They were known to be the roughest and toughest. I heard someone say something about tough Indians earlier. The roughest and toughest in the area. In fact, Houma, as a name for a people, is quite interesting. You'll find that most native peoples in their own language, their name means the people or the first. Houma means red. Red isn't just a color from Muskogean languages and dialects. Red is a term of honor. In fact, there was one Frenchman who claimed that the Red River was named for the Houma because they were these brave warriors of this region. I don't like to brag that much, so I'm not going to say that the Red River was named for us, but it's a nice thought. And then the last thing I'll say on this slide is, because I'm going to tie this all in, right? That's my main goal, is to show you how tradition carries down and we're not even aware. The alligator song. There's a story that a Jesuit writes when he's in the village, and he says, there's a Houma man who is sick, and they take him to the center of the village, and as they're trying to heal him, they're singing an alligator song. So our healers sing alligator songs, and I want you to remember that for much later. So, to quote Charlie Hill, who's the grandfather of Native comedy, the Houma had a bit of a real estate problem. And so by 1706 to 1709, somewhere in that period, we had to move down the river. And this is when I want to talk about, again, it's not just Houma history, but I just talk about the joy of history and also some of the issues you find. We start having conflicting sources. And so how do you deal with that? Well, with the Tunica massacre, so I told you we were where it is now called the Tunica Hills. The first Frenchman says, oh, the Tunica got into a bit of a tiff, and they came to the Houma for help. And the Houma warriors left to go mediate for them, and in the middle of the night, the Tunica massacred the women, the children, and the elders. And some fled, but they, most were killed. The second Frenchman says, no, wait a minute, you got that wrong. It was the Tainza, so another tribe beginning with a T, killing the Bayugula, our favorite frenemies, right, our next door neighbors. And the Houma just decided to migrate down the river with the Bayugula. I tend to lean toward the second version of events, not because, I'm sucking up to the Tunica, though they are good friends, they help with projects to this day, but because, again, our knowledge was carried down about our environment, and we lived right next to where the Red River met the Mississippi. Well, within less than 10 years of the Tunica moving into our former Grand Village, rivulets were going through the village. And I think the Houma could have very easily seen that river was shifting, because this is well before flood walls and levees. And so they knew, you know what, we have to deal with potential enslavement when we leave the village. All these people, all these allies are having these internal fights. And now we have the river shifting, and we're going to have to move anyway. Since the Bayugula are headed south because they've just been attacked, why don't we just go with them? And again, eventually the Houma would absorb the remnants of the Bayugula. This is a common thing, by the way, when I talk about one tribe absorbing remnants of another, or intermarriage. Many people don't realize that intermarriage was common, again, because we wanted to keep a robust and healthy group. We wanted to keep our lines not too crossed, if you know what I mean, in terms of genealogy. So that is a common thing, not just with the Houma, but with other peoples. And then you have Rosalie Couteau. Before I get to Rosalie Couteau, I have to back up because I got stuck on a side note and I forgot to talk about something important. One other thing I wanted to discuss, and it's not purely Houma, but it does tie into this, is that many people do not give credence to the fact that indigenous peoples did not just stay in our villages. We traveled, we knew each other, we had trade routes from the Pacific Northwest down to South America. In fact, the Houma, it is thought, but not proven, may have been the first people to bring Perique tobacco to Louisiana. So keep that in mind when I start talking about Rosalie Couteau. Now, for the Houma in the room who know, I'm not going to get into all the Rosalie Couteau myths. She is one of our hereditary chiefs. So again, that carries down, right? Egalitarian, it could be a woman hereditary chief. But every Houma family I've ever met has had a story about Rosalie Couteau. She was so dynamic a person, so charismatic, and she actually helped to preserve land and fought for her people. But I won't get into all the stories of the wars and the battles she went into, though I will say there is a memorial service being held at her tombstone as a warrior in and of herself this coming Saturday, in fact. But it goes back to that thought of conflict of sources. So Rosalie Couteau is born in the late 1700s, and by the early 1800s, she's married a man called Jacques. Oddly enough, from right down in Plaquemines, depending on which source you believe. Records in the early 1800s were a bit questionable. That's one of the points I will make. But she marries Jacques. And Jacques fights in the War of 1812, and he fights under Lafitte, and who else? Gamby and Thibodeau. But when Rosalie Couteau later in her life goes to request her widow's pension, they say that they cannot find a record that he fought with Lafitte or he fought in the War of 1812. What's interesting here is Rosalie Couteau consistently in censuses said that she was a Native woman in the later part of her life. I cannot speak to earlier. I have not seen those records. And at the time period when she puts forth in this request for a pension, Native peoples were not allowed. Interracial marriage as a whole was not allowed. Interracial marriage had actually been banned the year before she married Jacques Billiot. Now another woman named Minette Renaud, she was also Houma. She put on her request for pension that she was white, even though in different censuses she was different things, and she received a pension. But I love this story because we get into talk very briefly about pirates. You know, I mentioned Jean Lafitte. This is in a time period where not all the Houma are living down the bayou, but we have become the predominant people down the bayou. There's not many other folks wanting to live there at this point. And so we had a lot of interaction with the privateers, often because they wanted to avoid the people that would confiscate their items or want to tax them for their items. And so we knew that there was that interaction. As a matter of fact, one of the most common surnames in the Houma, or at least a common surname, is Soleil. We know for a fact Soleil was a crew member under Lafitte who married into the Houma. But I talked about trade routes and I said it was gonna come back to her story, or at least somewhat to her time period. And, you know, at this time when we're moving down the bayous, again, we came from the hills, we came from agriculture, and we ended up where there was more wetland, right? More palmetto. And so our material goods had to change. In this same time period, you start to see Houma people marrying peoples in Central and South America or having them come up and intermarry with us. And to this day, there have been studies shown that the Houma people were the only North American people to have specific types of blowguns and basket weaving patterns that were only ever seen otherwise in Central and South America. And last note about Rosalie Couteau, and it's just because it's fun, y'all. You have to have fun with history. I told you there's a good chance, you know, that they hung out with privateers, and Rosalie Couteau was quite a warrior herself, and her husband supposedly served under Lafitte. That's what she claimed, and I believe her. And I told you that every family has a myth about Rosalie, and my favorite myth is this, and I'll try to be as professional as possible. Rosalie Couteau and Jean Lafitte had a very close friendship. But in this same time period, we'll leave her there for now. Oh, actually, I do want to point out one more thing. Even when you don't find exactly what you're looking for in a historical document, you find out more than you knew before. I just received this document when I started working on this presentation, and I can now tell you, you know, my ancestor, Jacques Billiot's height. You know, he was 5'2". I'm glad we've grown a bit since then. His hair color and things of that nature. So it's always fun to, you know, figure out what you weren't even looking for and the interesting things in these documents. But we come to Tasso time. I know Uncle Bill, thank you. He gave me a great segue. We revived Tasso time. We'll talk more about that later. But what was Tasso time initially? Tasso time was the gathering of the Houma every year to reconnect as a people. Because when we migrated downriver and we got to the bayous, we had to spread out. My Papa Pete always told me it was like the fingers of a hand, the bayous. And so we spread out along those fingers. And every year, right after trapping season, which happened in winter, we would come together. I love the romance, the romantic language in this. We took a flotilla of pirogues out to the Gulf Coast, and we would make these woven willow nets, and we would catch the fish, and we would smoke and dry and make fish tasso. This was the first time I'd ever heard of fish tasso. But we would stay there for a week together. We would resolve conflict between families. We would have, you know, marriages from between the communities. Again, you don't want to marry your next door neighbor. And we would just play games and reconnect and reunite as a nation, as Houma. And so that was also happening again throughout the 1800s, I should say. So I'm going to get into the actual discussion, but very quickly, I don't have historical photos of Houma down in St. Bernard. I apologize. I'm sure some of my family do, but I decided to take this opportunity to show off my family. So this is my papa, my uncle Bobby, my aunt Jane, and it's all the siblings that were still alive after Katrina, a few years after. But they are the first generation that really grew up in St. Bernard. So I took you to 1900. I said Tasso time happened, all throughout the 1800s. And by the time the 20th century gets here, things are changing down the bayou. There's more interest in bayou communities because of oil, because of commercial, industry going down there. And it's not only that resources are now becoming contentious or becoming depleted for families, it's also that families down the bayou, Houma, Indian families, have no real opportunity to get their children an education. You do have the Methodists around Dulac, you have the Baptist church. My Aunt Jane told me, my great Aunt Jane, you know how it is down here. If it's an aunt, it's really could be a great aunt. If it's a cousin, it could be a second or third cousin. But my great aunt told me, when she was a little girl, she remembers that the Baptist in Punishin had a school for Indians, but they couldn't teach all of the students. And down the bayou, there was a lot more, it was very divided into you were black or you were white, and if you were anything else, you weren't going to school. It didn't matter what school, you weren't going anywhere. In point of fact, there were documents from federal government employees sending back telegrams saying, I have studied this native child. They show no features phenotypically of being black or white, but they're smart enough that we're going to pay, and we're going to send them to a residential boarding school. And I think most people now know what horrors awaited many students in residential boarding schools. So their options were limited, and by the 1920s and 30s, you have Houma parents, Houma families demanding an education for their children. The problem is when they're given a school in the 1930s, the first students go through it, and when they graduate, they get told, congratulations, your diploma isn't worth the paper it's printed on. You cannot go to a college, a trade school, you will be stuck where you were already. A lot of those, unfortunately, this is a side note, but I want to honor it, some of those first graduates ended up becoming casualties of war, because even when they had been mistreated by the system, they still went out and fought for this country, right? And so it was a very sad story. And so there was more economic opportunity in St. Bernard. There was more educational opportunity. And so my great papa, Orly, he had come up here a few years already with some of his siblings, and they were here during the winter for trapping season, right? And then they would go back home down the bayou. Well, by 1938, my Aunt Jane was 6 years old, and he moved the family up, and he was the first one. In fact, I had a cousin yesterday tell me that she remembers him as a leader of the Houma in St. Bernard, which made me feel very proud, because she says he led the people. He made them feel safe enough to leave Punishin. And so a couple of his siblings followed, and you had the Billiots. It's just like down the bayou. You have the Billiots and the Dardars and the Verdans and the Molinaires, and they all come to St. Bernard, and they all stay close together. Now, the photo on the far end is actually a photo of where Billiot Drive is now, right across from St. Bernard Catholic Church down the road, but they actually started even further down. But they all stayed together. They stayed as a community and as a unit. And a lot of them worked, again, Bill Highland mentioned the Isleños and the work that I do with them, and they have always credited us as Houma with helping them to adapt and to live here. So I asked about, did we really interact much? And in this particular time period, not overly much. We worked with each other, or we worked for them. We worked for, I shouldn't say we, I was not there. But my great papa worked for a Mellarine, and apparently he was involved in some historical events himself, like the Trapper Wars. I didn't ask too many questions once I heard there was a 3-day jail stint involved. But they had more economic opportunity, and they were known to be the best trappers. My great papa and his brother consistently won the bonus every year for the hides that they caught, the number and the quality. And that indigenous knowledge that no one can explain. My great aunt and her husband were telling me, my Uncle Marvin, they were telling me my great papa had a way of hiding a blemish or fixing a blemish in a hide to get the best price, and no one could figure out how he did it. And I like to think he learned that, from the natives down the bayou, from his own family. But they also gave back to that economy, right? And they also participated in larger things, including, they worked at a shipyard. And this is where I wanted to pause, because I keep talking a lot about Orly, but I don't want to forget Elvira, my great mama. because this woman was a welder in a shipyard. And when I heard that, I thought how amazing that was. I also worried a bit for anyone she might anger, because from everything I've heard about the woman, she could be a little sassy. Maybe you don't want to give her an open flame. But, it was great that she wasn't just, she was able to go out and also help provide, and I thought that was a very cool thing to hear. So economic opportunity, yeah. They came here when the resources were becoming more depleted down the bayou, and my Aunt Jane said, there was a depression. We didn't know. They always made sure we ate. We had food. And one thing she talked about that tied in beautifully was she remembered her mother, my great mama Elvira, having her help make fish tasso. She said at that point we also had pork, but we still made fish tasso. She moved here in 1938. 1938 was the same year that article in the previous slide came out, and the gentleman who had spoken was already in his late 70s, and tasso time as a gathering hadn't occurred since 1900, but the actual practice still remained, and I thought that was really cool. But I got sidetracked because that's what I do to myself. I started talking about education down the bayou, and I didn't talk about education up this way. And yes, it was much easier for the students to go to school, for the children to go to school, but they still spoke French as their first language. Another fun fact, Houma speak one of the oldest versions of French still spoken in the world. We speak the French as we were taught it, or my elders speak the French, I do not, unfortunately. They speak the French as it was taught to our ancestors in 1699 when they left a young boy named Saint Michel with the Houma so that he could learn their language and they could learn his. And so French was still the first language. And so before they could go to school, or when they first got to school, they had to learn English. And they were brutally punished for this, both down the bayou and St. Bernard. They were beaten. The boys, my dad and I were speaking earlier, were forced to kneel on rice, hard rice, uncooked rice. And it wasn't just in the classroom, but even in the schoolyard if they spoke to their own sibling in the wrong language. And this was such a traumatic experience and so ingrained in my papa that I remember my great papa died when I was 5 years old. And up until that point, when I would go to him, they would tell me what to say in French, and he would respond to me in French, and I loved that. And once he died, my papa would not speak any French to me at all, no matter how often I begged. And I've heard that my dad and his siblings asked the same thing. They wanted to learn French, and he said, honey, you don't understand. They're going to hold it against you, and they're going to hurt you. Now, my papa loved to make a joke, so years later, when I said, look, they have all these French schools, he said, well, you're too old to learn now, so I still don't know French. But that was the situation that they were faced with. Now, once they were able to speak English and they could get through their education, my papa was the first one in his family to graduate high school. He did it so he could keep playing football, but he got his diploma. 2 of his siblings got their diplomas after him, and by the next generation, his children all have college degrees, and my dad has a master's as well. They had more opportunity than any of their cousins down the bayou, because I've spoken to the people in my dad's generation down the bayou, and they said we didn't even have a chance to go to college till 69 or 70. When segregation ended down the bayou, they floated the Indian school up on a barge, put it behind the high school, and said, look, desegregation, go to your building. So we were very fortunate that we had the opportunity, and we came to St. Bernard. All right, present day. Oh, I think y'all expected more out of me than I could talk about these things. But first, I want to give a nod. If you notice this title, it says a repeat. And I'll give my mother that one because she says my passion for my people, my passion for Native issues in general is a repeat of my papa. My papa was called Pete. There you go. I see you laughing over there. I have to make a joke about you, your family. But what carried down? What carried down through all that time, literally from the 1600s to now? Movers and shakers. The woman in the far corner is Kareem Polk. She's alive today. She's one of those Houma children that got sent to a boarding school with the Cherokee. Sent away to get an education. And she is a staunch advocate to this day for indigenous education, Native education in Louisiana, and she's also been outspoken for Native veterans in the state of Louisiana, because when her brother came home, he was not given the same recognition or opportunity as the non-Native veterans who returned from war. So one of my favorite quotes from her is, our men are really good men. They do their best to provide for their families, but our women are the movers and the shakers. And I think that travels down, I think it's partially at least, right? Because we have never been in a culture that tells us we are stuck in one role. We are always told to go out and do as much as we can. And so we've had 4 female chiefs just in recent political history as the United Houma Nation. Myself and one of the women sitting in that row, Haley Dardar, we are the female founders of the Houma Language Project. The majority of the volunteers in the Houma Language Project in Tasso Time are women. The people going out that are working on environmental issues, that are going out and educating our youth, including Janie Luster, who's a weaver and a jewelry maker and a culture bearer, it's our women who carry things forward. And let's go back to warrior women. I have an aunt in the room who was a state trooper, retired from state police. We continue that tradition. Even if we didn't know everything that we do, we've continued it. Tasso Time, yeah, we brought it back. I love history, and I love to see the bits of culture that I know we can revive from history. There's a quote that goes around Indian country, and it says this: your culture, your language, these things are never dead. They are asleep and waiting for you to awaken them. And I was gonna wake up Tasso Time. So when I read that story about Tasso Time and what they did, I said, oh, I can't get us all to the Gulf for a week. We all have jobs. But I can get us together for a weekend with the help of the Isleños. I can use that space. And we bring together culture bearers. We bring together the carvers and the weavers. We bring back traditional foods, because there's also a health disparity. On average, Native people live 10 years less than everyone around them. And so if we can get them to eat those healthy traditional foods, we're gonna serve them at Tasso Time. We have the students, they're not my students, that's for certain. We have everyone playing traditional games like chunky and rabbit stick game and stickball, learning about traditional dyes and plant medicines, traditional plant medicines. And it's a time for us to come together and to remember who we are as a people and to reconnect as family. You know, the best thing I saw the first year of Tasso Time, which was in 2022, it would have been 2020, but we had this thing called a pandemic. That is, we still have COVID, but at least we've kind of knocked it down a notch. But we have a lot of people who were adopted out, even in my generation. And one of the most meaningful moments to me is I had a woman come up to me and said, I can tell you now. I spent an hour with a Sole, oddly enough. I spent an hour with Johnny Sole, and I can tell you how you're my cousin. I can tell you who's my cousin in this room. And that person has become a critical volunteer for Tasso Time moving forward, and has learned more and brought more and participated in culture. And it gave them what? That positive identity. It gave them the piece that they were missing. And then to hear my aunt talk about making fish tasso, I'm like, I didn't even know that you did that as a kid. But I brought back the thing where they used to do it, right? And maybe one day I'll learn how to make fish tasso too. I don't know, I have to talk to her about that one. But Houma Language Project, it's the last story I'll tell. I know I've gone a little quick, and I apologize. I've had a lot of coffee today. I also have no filter, if you couldn't tell. But Houma Language Project, I told you, I said that first slide about Houma history itself, I said I'm gonna tell you a story about alligator songs and healers. And it's gonna take a while, but we're gonna come back to it. Haley, I can't look at you, I'll cry. Houma Language Project started 10 years ago. After a decade, we finally have our first comprehensive language learning tool. We have a team of about 7 that are solidly in there constantly. We meet several hours a week, some of us. But it started with a recording. And it started with a copy of a recording of my great mama Elvira talking about Houma, talking about being Indian, and she and another woman, Valentine Dardar, singing their versions of the alligator song. What makes it better is that my great mama, while she was not a traiteur, she was not the healer of the family, that was her sister Emma, she was very well known for her understanding, at least to the people I've talked to. She did know about some of the plant medicines. So how beautiful is it that, centuries later, it's a healer in the tribe singing an alligator song, Chanchuba, that starts the Language Reclamation Project. I thought that was a beautiful symmetry, and it carried down through all those centuries, and we didn't even know how much we still knew and how we could revive it, right? It was just waiting for us to awaken it. So the way I did this when I spoke at what did I speak at? The Battle of New Orleans Summit. And I loved it so much, I continued it. This is my Papa Pete, and that is my great Papa Orally. And the way I like to think of it is this: my goal is not to create my own legacy. It's to continue the legacy of all the people who came before me, who carried this down to me. And so I'll leave you with this last thought. Elapa, elansa Houma. We're still here. Thank you. Yakukechitu. I did kind of speed through that. I apologize. So. What's in Tasso? Maybe. What's in Tasso? Aside from dried meat and maybe some salt, I couldn't tell you because I've not actually gotten to make it. You see, that's one of the things I'm still working to bring back. That and traditional canoe making, the big war canoes, I want to bring that back as well. I don't know if Daddy, you or any of your siblings have made tasso, or if y'all made that with Great Mama, but yeah, I mean, traditionally, I know they use salt to preserve, right? So let's backtrack. Tasso time happened right after trapping season because you were going into a season of hardship where there was going to be less to eat. And so you smoked fish and then you distributed it amongst the people. They took their fish with them so they'd always have something to eat, and they went home and planted their gardens for the summer. And by the end of summer, by harvest time, beginning of fall, they would have food there as well. But I don't actually know. I can ask my Aunt Jane, she might know. But I don't know what else they might have put in it other than salt. Oh, actually, Aunt Janie, I see you hiding. So Aunt Janie, actually, she's a relative, so I call her Aunt, but she's Houma. She's basically an aunt. Janie told me once, she said, we got some of our salt from leaving the water out when we were at Tasso time because it would slowly deplete. The water would slowly burn up in the sun of the heat of the day, and the salt will be left. So, Aunt Janie, do you know how the fish tasso, if there was anything else in it?
Basically, it was salt, and the fish was garfish.
I'll repeat it.
The garfish was smoked. It was salted down, sliced in thin pieces. My mom would use her clothesline, and she had a drum that she would build a fire in using different kinds of wood, and that fish was smoked. Now, when I started talking about tasso, doing some demonstration with Chef John Falls down in Dulai, it was exciting to hear the stories of people coming to me telling me, so-and-so across the street, right over there, would do the same way, Grand Isle, each little community would make garfish tassos, and basically it's almost like the salmon, was to the northern people. Garfish was our smoked fish.
I'm going to try and repeat as much of that as I can for the recording without forgetting anything. So it was garfish. That's good to know. And your mom hung it on a line, and it was smoked. I do know that way back when we had both smoked and dried options, they like to give you a selection. But it was smoked, and you said you actually heard several other families say that they had the same thing going on as your parents. Apparently I'm hard to see. I don't know that I need people to see me after I've been up here for over half an hour. I hope that helps. I hope that answers the question. Okay. You have a question?
No, I want to explain something.
Okay. Well, wait, take the mic. Y'all, this is now not only an interdisciplinary and intergenerational event. We're going to have my dad come up. That was Aunt Janie Luster. This is Keith Billiot.
You're doing great, love.
I know, you had a steal my mic?
No. I was just going to tell you, and you could tell it. But so I can't speak to what happened down on the bayou. I can only speak to what happened in St. Bernard. But my brother and I remembered a couple things when you were talking about the tasso that I'll tell you about your papa and my papa. But in St. Bernard, I suppose it was from my papa in the Houma tradition. But my brother and I were just discussing it. A couple of things. Number one, right around, it happened in the spring. So garfish spawn in the spring. Every year we would hunt garfish. We didn't fish them, we hunted them. Garfish back then, we would hunt them in the swamps and in the marshes, and water was usually about, what would you say, Kevin, 4 feet? It wasn't deep, but yeah, it was waist deep. And so the garfish come to the surface, particularly during spawning time. They go up there anyway, but they come to the surface. We would hunt them with large caliber revolvers or rifles, 30-30s. Sometimes some people would even use shotguns. The Cajuns, the Houma always used whatever they had, right? I mean, we didn't have big expensive rifles back then. But we would hunt them, and then we would bring them back home, and my mama, her great mama, Elvira, and the other ladies, Miss Martine and the other native ladies that lived in our little community, we would clean them, but then they took the meat along the lines of what you were saying, and they processed the meat. And I remember some of the best fish I ever had. Garfish is if you've never had it, it's a very soft meat. But she would make garfish balls. Now, I don't recall, and it could be that we were too young, because due to some work by the Army Corps of Engineers and whatnot, by the time that we were, 12, 13, 14 at the latest, that was over. There was not a place that we could find where we could hunt the garfish when they were spawning. So I don't remember tasso, and I don't remember us ever hearing the term tasso, but another thing that my brother, Kevin, sitting right there, and I remembered, my daddy actually taught us, he would take small shrimp. We always fished and everything. He would take small shrimp that we would catch that were really too small to cook, really. And we would still peel those. And I remember, it's very difficult to peel Mr. Bill can tell you, a very small shrimp. But we would peel them for hours. And then he'd lay them out in the sun and put a little salt on them. And so maybe that is a shrimp tasso. I don't know. But he did that. We always did that when we were a little bitty. We never knew. I don't know that he ever told us what it was called. But again, up until we were probably 12, 13, Kevin and I started working on boats for other people. But when we were trawling for our family, that's what he would do with the shrimp. So I imagine that came down from our family, from our Houma legacy.
So really quick, now that you're up here, you've reminded me of part of my presentation, and I know why it was a little bit shorter. I talked about the blowguns. My dad actually told me this about my papa. It's funny, and I think if you are a younger person, and I know the young people that I know in the crowd already know this, but talk to your elders, because they never realize how much they know. And they never think that what they know is significant. So I didn't know this when my papa was alive, but you were the one who told me his first weapon was a blowgun. And first off, can I tell you, the kid in me went, I didn't get a blowgun. Why didn't I get a blowgun? But even that far along, across centuries and miles and migration down the bayou, back up to the parish, they were still doing these traditional things. And I thought that was really interesting. I did finally get to use a blowgun, but I had to go all the way to Mississippi to meet the Choctaw to do it. Thank you.
Well, so I know for a fact that my daddy used to talk about how good my brother and I's Uncle Willie, one of his brothers, was with a blowgun. They used blowguns all the way up into, Daddy was born in 39. They used blowguns throughout his teenage years, and actually even when they were young adults. So I don't know. It's very interesting to me what Colleen brought up about, I'm not aware of, other than apparently some Cherokee in this book that I have got, and I think I gave it to her, like I gave her the tape with my grandmother singing years ago. There's a book, and it's about, if you want to look it up, I think it's called The Choctaw Before Removal, right? I think it's The Choctaw Before Removal is the title of the book. But they used blowguns too, but it's the only two nations that I know of, the Houma and the Choctaw, in our region of the U.S. that used blowguns. So it was interesting that she found that. I didn't realize that we probably did gain that, or maybe they got it from us, but we probably did get that use of blowguns and how to make them from the Central and South American tribes.
Yeah. Well, there were other tribes in the Southeast who had blowguns. I think my point was more, we had two different types. And in the Southeast, you only saw one of those types, and the other type only the Houma had, and it had come from Central and South America. But yeah, the Choctaw definitely had blowguns, because if you ever have a weekend, go to Choctaw Fair, please, and you can do all the traditional games as well. In fact, the Mississippi Choctaw are great, distant relatives to us, and they come out in Tasso time, and they play traditional games with us, and we talk about language sometimes, so thank you. You provided some great info. I feel like I should be Vanna White going, Keith Billiot. There he is. Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you, Yakukege, for your presentation.
Can I pause really quickly? Everyone, this is Haley Dardar. She is the co-founder of Houma Language Project.
But I have a question. Ooh, I can just yell it. It's just, it was too much.
Well, the recording. They need to hear for the
You
recording.
can repeat it, maybe.
Okay, I'll repeat it.
You're doing all of this work, and particularly in St. Bernard Parish, and a lot of it is coming from the legacy that Pete left you. Thinking forward with your own work that you're doing, what are you hoping is your legacy?
Oh, man. I'm going to rely on, again, it's a common phrase in Indian country, so I can't say that it's Houma, but it's something that I very much agree with. We do things for the 7 generations that came before us and for the 7 generations that come after. Houma Language Project, let's be honest, it took centuries to eradicate the Houma language completely. John Swanton, who, if you don't know, was a very well-renowned academic that the US government sent out to study tribes, was still getting words in Houma in the 1920s, or 1911, I believe, was the first edition published. But it took centuries to get rid of the Houma language. It's going to take centuries to have it become a fluent and often used language amongst the community. So I don't know that I have a legacy, dream where it's like everyone's going to be speaking Houma in my lifetime. That's not realistic. I think as long as I see all the projects that I do continue to grow and I see the joy that comes out of them, I will expand on that actually. Let's talk about the joy of that. Houma Language Project, just in the past year, we had a family send us a photo. They had happy birthday written in Houma for their son and their cake. And the Walmart lady was so nice, she called to make sure that they hadn't just written chicken scratch and she was misreading it. And it said, Ayatatuk ni taknayakpa, happy birthday. And he was also one of our interns, that young man. His name is Jace. But we've also had the first film. Oh, that was in my slides. Y'all, I missed so much. I was so nervous. So if you looked, actually, let me see if I can backtrack on this thing. Yes. So if you look at this image right here, this is only from, a week or 2 ago, Haley? The first short film utilizing Houma, utilizing our reclaimed native language, called Ekbe is the name of the short film, was done by Mariah. She's in the center. Her grandparents are around her. If you want to know more about experiences of Houma people in school, they talk about it in that short film. And it was so moving. Haley and I had one of our linguists sitting between us, and in the middle of this short film, she grabs my hand, and we're holding fists through this because it was so powerful to us. It took 10 years to get to this point, and we have youth already taking off and doing things in the language. And that means that we are doing exactly what we set out to do. We're creating that positive identity, and we're allowing them to use their own language, their own voice, and their own story. So really, it's just the continuation of good things for my people. I hope more people help out because I am very exhausted every time Tasso time comes. And I do have more people stepping up, but I just hope that it brings us together. I think we're facing a lot in terms of, again, we had previous historical challenges, we have modern ones. And so many of us have had to move away for economic opportunity. What did we hear? Economic opportunity, depletion of resources. You know, we have another member of Houma Language Project where her family used to all live down the bayou was finally completely submerged during Hurricane Ida. After Hurricane Ida, when we all got power back, we didn't even have a Houma Language Project meeting. We had a come together and check in on each other meeting online. And she was crying. And she said, how do I explain to my children how important this place was and where their family was and where I used to go and play when they can't even see it because it's underwater? And that's part of Houma Language Project. It's why we do so many digital things. It's why we have Tasso time, because we need to preserve as much as we can and keep that community culture and that identity in facing the things that all coastal peoples face, not just Houma. So yeah, I just hope it all keeps going forward and people take away something good from it.
Colleen, on behalf of our college and our entire community, we are so thankful. We owe you a debt of gratitude for being with us this evening and not only expanding our knowledge, but truly igniting a passion for this work. And so we hope that you continue to partner with us and return to be a part of the History Lecture Series. So let's give it up for Colleen again. Just a couple more thank yous. I want to thank all of our staff members that take part in the History Lecture Series and volunteer their time to be with us. Seth Braniff, David Bolero, Jason Brown, Paige Davis, Jennifer O'Sullivan, and Jacinta Massey. Thank you for your help in keeping this series going, so I want to give them a round of applause. And also, save the date. Our annual Battle of New Orleans Historical Symposium is right around the corner. Mr. Highland and I will be sharing a detailed schedule via email shortly that will also be available on our website. The Battle of New Orleans Historical Symposium will take place on Friday, January the 5th, here at the college, beginning at 9:30 a.m. If you have never participated in this event before, please join us. You will be in for a treat. It is a 2-day series filled with local authors and historians that speak to their knowledge about the Battle of New Orleans. So day 1 will take place here, Friday, January the 5th. We will also have a Battle of New Orleans luncheon for all of the guests that participate. And then day 2, Saturday, January 6th, will take place at the St. Bernard Parish Government Complex in the council chambers, and we'll have a half day of guest lecturers there. So save the dates. Please join us. It's a wonderful event. As part of the Battle of New Orleans commemorative activities, we will also have reenactors that will be on site and some other events happening in the community. So it's a wonderful way to celebrate our history, our culture, our heritage. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you all for keeping the History Lecture Series going. I know, we had almost a 2-year hiatus through COVID, but we're so excited and delighted to have you all back face to face. Many of you have asked about videos, so we are, thanks to Seth in our IT department, filming each of these lectures. They're available on our Nunez YouTube channel, along with other great content about our college. You can get to our YouTube page if you visit our website. So we'll have this lecture up in about a week. So thank you so much. Please stay, network. I'm sure Colleen will be willing to answer some questions with us. And again, thank you so much for being here.